Hi, this is Elvis Presley. I guess the first thing people want to know is why I can't stand still when I'm singing. Some people tap their feet, some people snap their fingers, and some people just sway back and forth. I just sort of do them all together, I guess. Singing rhythm and blues really knocks it out. I watch my audience and listen to them, and I know that we're all getting something out of our system, and none of us knows what it is. The important thing is that we're getting rid of it and nobody's getting hurt. I suppose you know I've got a lot of cars. People have written about it in the papers, and a lot of them write and ask me why. Well, when I was driving a truck, every time a big shiny car drove by, it started me sort of daydreaming. I always felt that someday, somehow, something would happen to change everything for me, and I'd daydream about how it would be. Maybe someday I'm going to have a home and a family of my own, and I'm not going to budge from it. I was an only child, but maybe my kids won't be.
Remember, it wasn't just the way Elvis looked, it was the way he moved that made people crazy, pissed off, driven to screaming ecstasy, and profane revulsion. That was television. When they made an attempt to censor him from the waist down, it was because of what you could see happening in his pants. Elvis was the first modern 20th century man, the precursor of the sexual revolution, of the civil rights revolution, drawn from the same Memphis as Martin Luther King, creating fundamental outsider art that would be embraced by a mainstream popular culture. Television and Elvis gave us full access to a new language, a new form of communication, a new way of being, a new way of looking, a new way of thinking about sex, about race, about identity, about life, a new way of being an American, a human being, and a new way of hearing music. Once Elvis came across the airwaves, once he was heard and seen in action, you could not put the genie back in the bottle. After that moment, there was yesterday, and there was today, and there was a red-hot rockabilly forging of a new tomorrow before your very eyes. Every musician has their Genesis moment. For you, it might have been the Sex Pistols, or Madonna, or Public Enemy. It's whatever initially inspires you to action. Mine was 1956, Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was the evening I realized a white man could make magic, that you did not have to be constrained by your upbringing, by the way you looked, or by the social context that oppressed you. You could call upon your own powers of imagination, and you could create a transformative self. A certain type of transformative self that perhaps at any other moment in American history might have seemed difficult, if not impossible.
To clear this myth of what Elvis was in society and what his purpose was in music, especially Black American music, I decided to take a look into this thing called cultural appropriation in conjunction with a man named Elvis Presley, who was considered to be
the king of rock and roll.
There was no retraction. I was like saying, number one, when I wrote the record, right? We as Black people always grew up around Elvis, but why is he the king? Why is he the icon? And I was trying to say in that record, dude, there's not only is there Little Richard still around, Bo Diddley at the time, everybody was around. Even Jerry Lee Lewis. Not only were they just as iconic, and they deserved a king too, or Elvis did deserve to be called king, but they were doing gigs. at the same time. So this whole Elvisism, I was done with.
There you go. The leader and founder of Public Enemy, Chuck D, legendary hip-hop group.
Now, Chuck wrote one of the coldest lines in hip-hop history in the song Fight the Power. Fight the Power was written for Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing, released in 1989. Now with Chuck, everything boils down to facts and context. His lyrical content about John Wayne and Elvis still sparks controversy and debate to this day.
I don't know nothing about the humble Elvis with Sam Phillips in 1957. All I know is this dude's on TV all the time, these corny ass movies, and all of a sudden he's gun-toting with Nixon on drugs, and at the same time we getting criticized for a bunch of things as a black demographic.
So it's important to put into context what Chuck is trying to convey here. It's not about tearing down an American rock and roll legend. It's about the concerns of what the culture may have had for actions that was implemented in the past.
It's about who's representing the culture, or what has been institutionalized.
Elvis probably represented something that, when you look back at it now, possibly illuminates to where America was and highlights in so many ways where America still is.
For the vulgar performances of Elvis Presley.
It's shocking. I watched him gyrate his legs and swivel his hips. And our parent-teachers group feels he should not be on television.
We've set up a 20-man committee to do away with this vulgar, animalistic rock and roll bop. Our committee will check with the restaurant owners and the cafes to see what Presley records is on their machines, and then ask them to do away with them.
What was the outrage?
Maybe it was because he was an American who happened to be a white man who expressed himself through the American black culture.
What did Elvis think about this at the time?
I don't feel I'm doing anything wrong.
Rock and roll has got to go. And go it does at KWK. We're all through playing rock and roll records. This week is record-breaking week here at KWK. And after this week, no more rock and roll will be played on the air.
The obscenity and vulgarity of the rock and roll music is obviously a means by which the white man and his children can be driven.
Could be driven to mix with the black man. I think that's what he wanted to actually say.
Now, let's keep things in perspective. We're talking about the 50s, right? We're talking about a time in America where there was segregationists. There was laws that was not passed yet to end certain issues that America was going through.
So along come this kid back in 1954 talking about that's all right, mama. Is he what? Is he black? Who is he? What is he? Who he was an outlier. I mean, the conventional wisdom casts Elvis as one in a long line of craven white exploiters of black musical culture, for whom African Americans had nothing but contempt.
So once again, perspective, right? Was Elvis an exploiter of the culture? Or was he just simply being himself? What do you think?
So when Elvis Presley breathed his last breath and the press hailed him as the king of rock and roll, it was like Old Man River cried out, "Nah, he ain't. My friend Chuck Berry's the king of rock." Presley was merely a prince who profited from the royal talent of a sovereign ruler, vested with tremendous creativity. Had Berry been white, he could have rightly taken Presley's throne and worn his crown well.
Elvis Presley has to be one of the most outstanding people that it's been my pleasure to meet in my lifetime. After listening to his voice, seeing his demeanor, his manner, and what I thought was a very different style, I was highly impressed with what I thought he could do as an artist. And regardless of what happened to Elvis in his latter years, he had one of the strongest souls and spirits about him of any person I've ever seen. Bad, good, indifferent.
But the truth of the matter was, it was far from simple and plain. Elvis' relationship with and reputation among African Americans was complex, particularly in the mid-1950s when he burst onto the national scene as part of a biracial rock and roll phenomenon that erupted just as the campaign against racial segregation in the American South began to gather real momentum. At that time, the black press proudly pointed out the critical influence of black blues, rhythm and blues, and gospel music on Presley's style. Not to chastise him for cultural appropriation, but to applaud his impeccable taste at a time when black music was routinely denied mainstream radio and television airtime and often denigrated as immoral and barbaric. One magazine noted at the time, Presley makes no secret of his respect for the Negroes, nor of their influence on his singing. Furthermore, he does not shun them, either in public or private. Presley himself was humble about his relationship with black music and musicians. Here's what he said. "A lot of people seem to think I started this business, but rock and roll was here a long time before I came along. Nobody can sing that kind of music like colored people. Let's face it, I can't sing like Fats Domino can. I know that." While there has never been any necessary or simple correlation between white love of black music and racially progressive politics in the late 1950s and early 1960s, many black commentators, musicians, and fans viewed the emergence of a biracial market for rock and roll music performed by black and white singers as a portent of maybe even a vehicle for better race relations. Indeed, there is plenty of evidence that black attitudes towards Elvis were far from uniformly hostile. I thank God for Elvis Presley. I thank the Lord for sending Elvis to open that door so I can walk down the road, you understand? Commented his contemporary Little Richard in 1970. You see, Little Richard was one of the many black rock and rollers who suffered financially from the cover phenomenon, in which white artists took anodyne copies of black songs into the pop charts. Little Richard appreciated that the whole rock and roll phenomenon, with Elvis as its epicenter, had opened up new opportunities for black artists and songwriters to reach a young white audience. The era of biracial musical creation and consumption has been largely erased from popular memory. It lies buried beneath simplistic parables of white expropriation and exploitation of black culture. Elvis has become emblematic of centuries of uncompensated and unacknowledged white appropriation of black cultural ingenuity and labor.
It's a combination of country music and gospel and rhythm and blues all combined is what it really was. As a child, I was influenced by all that. It was a place called The Shell. And when I left the stage, they were yelling and screaming and stuff. I did 2 songs. It scared me to death, man. I didn't know what I'd done. The manager backstage, I said, What'd I do? He said, well, whatever it is, go back and do it again. So I went back out and I did the same thing again. I really didn't know what the yelling was about, screaming. I didn't realize that I was moving, my body was moving. It was a natural thing to me, you know.
Elvis had a real feel for latching on to something that caught his ear.
Presence is Elvis. I don't think anyone's had as strong a presence.
No, you know, one of the things that's fascinating about Elvis is how he became consumed by fame and how fame destroyed him. That's one of the things that's fascinating. I mean, I have the regular fan thing too, where, you know, I like the Jailhouse Rock number. But what's fascinating about him as I've become older, you know, and it's gotten past, you know, oh, he's cool Elvis. It's like, wow, everything, you know, and how the people around him just let him destroy himself, and how he was still famous. And then after he's dead, then you hear all of this stuff, you know. It's like, wow, all that was going on when we was thinking he was super cool Elvis, you know. So it's just Elvis is fascinating just because it's like, this is what fame can do to you, you know.
It was mainly parents, and they were against rock and roll, you know. Anyway, before the Beatles came on, I mean, people have been trying to stamp out rock and roll since it started. Because it came from black music, and the words had a lot of double entendre in the early days. And it was sort of, you know, the white kids, our white, nice wasps are gonna go crazy with all this moving their bodies. You know, the music got to your body, and the Beatles just carried it a bit further, made it a little more white even than Elvis did.
So out of this band came the banjo player, Lonnie Donegan, and he was into, it was really bluegrass and what is like Hank Williams or country blues type of thing. And so he started this thing which was, they call skiffle, because you know Lonnie Donegan had a #1 hit in America with Rock Island Line.
I mean, it was bad enough him coming out of the army and doing Are You Lonesome Tonight, you know. I wanted him to stay wild, to give me all those edges, that kind of, that howl that he had. But, you know, he was just amazing and spectacular, and it was just that he really opened the door to my whole love of music. Maybe Alan Freed was trying to do with Chuck and Bo and all that sort of stuff, but he was a great looking guy, and he actually, that physical representation, by the time he got to England, guys would like hit themselves on the head, bang, what's going on? Who's this human being?
So I heard this sort of treat me like a fool, treat me mean and cruel. The sound of that voice was heavenly, and I hadn't got any hairs on my chest or anything like that. There was something going on in my body. I was moving through the spheres. I was falling in love with my teacher at school. Everything was going on, and Elvis was the soundtrack to that. And on and on and on and on.
My company that I worked for at the time would always contract Mr. Phillips to let us in anytime that we had something to record, and usually Elvis would be there practicing a lot of times. He had several people, but at that time he was a handsome guy, good looking. I didn't think too much about his playing or singing. I mean, it was okay, but I didn't see at that time what I saw later on.
When he started, I think he really had serious aspirations about becoming a serious actor, and they just wouldn't let him out of the box because they had a jewel there. They had the golden egg. You know, they knew they could count on him where he was, and so they left him there, and he couldn't get out of the box. And I think that had a lot to do with what happened to him later. He was unfulfilled, despite the fact that he was worshipped worldwide as the king of rock and roll. I mean, he'd pack him in. He's still packing him in. He's been gone how many years? But his own personal development, his own spiritual development was hampered because he made it so fast, so big. There wasn't anything that he had to model on. There was nobody had ever been there before. I mean, he was getting sunburned from his climb.
Brown versus Board of Education ruled segregation illegal in schools, allowing black kids to attend white schools, which included busing between black and white neighborhoods, and it became the first step taken towards ending segregation. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1955, while Little Richard started to rise to fame, transforming the way white and black folk shared public spaces while combating racial stereotypes show by show. Elvis Presley's first hit metaphorically cut the ribbon for rock and roll to become a lifestyle and genre white folk would embrace and which they could openly identify with. African American music, which had previously been derogated as race music, was now made available to a wider white audience, which changed its sound into a more sterile version of itself.
With the new music style, a new name was needed: rockin' and rollin'. Allegedly, an early 20th century black slang term for sexual intercourse.
This was the title of the rebellious, fast-paced, exciting new genre and lifestyle. 50s rock and roll loosened the dehumanizing ideology set by the Jim Crow laws and prepared culturally what the civil rights movement would achieve in the next decade. In the same year of 1954, the separate but equal policy which had ruled since 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, was raised with the United States Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education, ruling all the while a young white American man by the name of Elvis Presley was recording his first hit, That's Alright Mama, with rock and roll's most avant-garde producer Sam Phillips at Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee.
Elvis came out with a style of his own, and it was very creative. And once he got into it and he got that feel, Elvis just took off like a late freight. And with Elvis doing this kind of music, gave an injection to black music that no other artist had ever done.
Sam Phillips' philosophy remained sincerely unaffected by the cancerous segregation of his time. As a result, he produced rhythm and blues luminaries such as B.B. King, Rufus Thomas, and Ike Turner.
Sam Phillips released what some declare to be the first rock and roll single, Rockets 88, by the Ike Turner fronted band Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. Sam Phillips, over the time, his earnings were tenacious, and he soon realized that he would do better in the era of segregation if he could market black rock and roll to a white audience by proxy of white artists. As a businessman, Sam Phillips, I would say, was cunning, because previously many white teens would listen to rhythm and blues and often did so in secret in heavily segregated America. But Elvis brought rock and roll to the white world and presented an icon white teens would identify with. This blueprint will later become the trend. And step by step, African American influence receded into the background in the mainstream's perception of rock music.
I don't think there's any way you can tell the Elvis Presley story without telling about his relationship to the black community, to black culture and music. It's just not possible. And also, you got to think, like, there's no drama, because the fact that he was friends with B.B. King, the fact that he was at a time living in one of the White Houses in a black environment. There's a story in there of the little boy, and they go into the gospel tent and the preacher grabs him. That was told me by Sam Bell, who I found, who only passed last year. That story is totally true. Leave him be, he's with the Spirit. And that connection to gospel for the rest of his life, Sister Rosetta, all those influences, and more than influences too, I think, just a deep, abiding connection and respect and love. I mean, there's real love there. And that's got all missed a bit in the wash. And I'm not here to defend one way or the other. People should have their dialogue and their debate. But all I am as the ultimate outsider is to tell the story. And you can't tell the story of Elvis without telling the story of black America as well.
So there you go. The Purveyor of a Purpose, Part 2.
with Elvis Presley. Now, you make up your own mind. Was this cultural appropriation? Or was it cultural appreciation? What do you think? Thank you for watching. And thank you for listening. Stay tuned, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Well, thanks for letting me talk to you and sort of get things off of my chest. I sure appreciate your listening to my RCA Victor records, and I'd like to thank all the disc jockeys for playing them. Bye-bye.
The most special thing about Presley was that he had a mental picture. Now keep in mind, 18, 19-year-old kid, he had a mental picture of where he was going when he heard a few words of the song.